The storm hit Riverton, Wyoming, with a fury that matched the devil's own temper, and Frank Thornton watched from his weathered porch as the sky turned the color of old bruises, wondering if this would be the night his solitary life finally caught up with him in the form of divine reckoning. The wind howled through the canyon walls that cradled his small ranch, and he pulled his worn leather coat tighter around his shoulders, his blue eyes scanning the horizon with practiced vigilance. At 32 years old, Frank had lived alone for the better part of a decade, and he had grown accustomed to the silence that filled his days and nights like an unwelcome companion. The ranch hands who worked for him came and went with the seasons, but none stayed long enough to become anything more than passing acquaintances, and that suited him just fine, or so he told himself each morning when he woke to an empty house. The first drops of rain began to fall, fat and heavy, splattering against the dry earth with such force that they kicked up small clouds of dust. Frank turned to head inside when something caught his eye, a figure stumbling along the ridge road that led past his property toward town. He squinted against the growing darkness, his hand instinctively moving to shade his eyes from the wind-driven rain that now fell in sheets. The figure was small, struggling against the gale, and even from this distance, Frank could see they were in trouble. His heart, which had grown accustomed to a steady, unchanging rhythm, suddenly kicked against his ribs with urgency. Without thinking, Frank grabbed his hat from the hook by the door and ran toward the stable. His horse, a sturdy bay mare named Duchess, whinnied nervously as he threw the saddle over her back and tightened the cinch with practiced efficiency. The storm was getting worse by the second, and he knew that anyone caught out in it would be lucky to survive the night. The temperature was dropping fast, and hypothermia would set in quickly once the rain soaked through their clothes. Frank mounted up and urged Duchess forward, leaning low over her neck as they pushed into the storm. The wind tried to tear him from the saddle, and the rain pelted his face like tiny stones, but Frank kept his eyes fixed on the spot where he had seen the figure. As he drew closer, he could make out more details. It was a woman, her dark hair plastered to her head, her dress torn and muddy. She was struggling to stay upright, each step seeming to take every ounce of strength she possessed. Frank called out to her, but his voice was snatched away by the wind. He pushed Duchess harder, closing the distance between them until he was right beside her. "Madam, you need help," Frank shouted, reaching down toward her. The woman looked up at him, and even through the rain and darkness, Frank could see the fear and exhaustion in her eyes. They were a striking amber color, like honey held up to sunlight, and they grabbed hold of something deep in his chest and refused to let go. She nodded weakly, and Frank dismounted, wrapping his arm around her waist to support her weight. She was trembling violently, her skin cold to the touch even through the wet fabric of her dress. "Can you ride?" he asked, having to put his mouth close to her ear to be heard over the storm. "I will try," she managed to say, her teeth chattering so hard she could barely form the words. Frank lifted her onto Duchess's back and then swung up behind her, pulling her tight against his chest to share what warmth he could. He turned the mare toward home and gave her free rein, trusting her to find the way through the blinding storm. The woman sagged against him, and Frank tightened his hold, terrified she might slip from the saddle. The ride back to the ranch felt like it took hours, though it could not have been more than 15 minutes. Every second was torture as he felt the woman grow weaker in his arms. Finally, the dark shape of his house loomed out of the storm, and Frank guided Duchess to the porch. He dismounted and pulled the woman down after him, lifting her into his arms when her legs buckled beneath her. She weighed almost nothing, and he carried her easily through the front door and into the warmth of his home. The fire in the hearth had burned low, and Frank kicked the door shut behind him before carrying the woman to the settee near the fireplace. He laid her down gently and immediately set about building up the fire, throwing on several large logs until flames roared up the chimney. With the fire blazing, Frank turned his attention back to the woman. Her eyes were closed, and her breathing was shallow. He knew he needed to get her out of those wet clothes before the cold killed her. His house had no women's clothing, no wife who had left behind a wardrobe, just his own simple bachelor belongings. Frank grabbed a quilt from his bedroom and returned to the settee, his movements efficient despite his racing heart. "Madam, I need to get you warm," he said, though he was not sure she could hear him. "I am going to remove your wet things and wrap you in this quilt. I mean you no harm." Her eyes fluttered open briefly, and she gave the smallest nod before they closed again. Frank worked quickly, his hands steady despite his discomfort with the intimate task. He had been raised to respect women, and this situation went against every instinct of propriety he possessed, but he also knew that propriety would not save her life. He removed her sodden dress and undergarments, keeping his eyes averted as much as possible, and wrapped her securely in the thick quilt. Then he carried her to his bedroom and laid her on his bed, piling every blanket he owned on top of her. He returned to the main room and hung her wet clothes near the fire to dry, then stripped off his own soaked garments and changed into dry clothes. His mind was racing with questions. Who was she? Where had she come from? What had she been doing out on the ridge road in the middle of a storm? Frank made a pot of strong coffee and sat down in the chair beside the fireplace, listening to the storm rage outside and the quieter sound of the woman's breathing from the other room. An hour passed, then two. Frank dozed in his chair, jerking awake periodically to check on his unexpected guest. Around midnight, he heard a soft sound from the bedroom and rose to investigate. The woman's eyes were open, and she was looking around the unfamiliar room with confusion and fear. "You are safe," Frank said quickly, staying in the doorway to avoid frightening her further. "I am Frank Thornton. This is my ranch outside Riverton. I found you on the ridge road during the storm." The woman's amber eyes focused on him, and some of the fear eased from her expression. "I remember," she said, her voice hoarse. "You saved me." "Anyone would have done the same," Frank said, though they both knew that was not necessarily true. Many men would have ridden right past, unwilling to risk themselves for a stranger. "I am Olivia Reeves," the woman said. "I was traveling to Riverton when my horse threw me. He ran off, and I was trying to reach town on foot when the storm hit." "Traveling alone?" Frank asked, unable to keep the surprise from his voice. Olivia's jaw tightened slightly. "Yes, alone. I had no other choice." Frank recognized the tone of someone who did not wish to be questioned further, so he let it drop. "Are you hungry? I can make something." "I do not wish to impose further," Olivia said, though Frank could hear the hunger in her voice. "It is no imposition," he assured her. "You need to eat to get your strength back." He left her in the bedroom and went to the kitchen, where he fried up some bacon and eggs and made fresh coffee. He arranged everything on a tray and carried it back to the bedroom, setting it on the small table beside the bed. Olivia had pulled herself into a sitting position, keeping the blankets wrapped tightly around herself. "Your clothes are drying by the fire," Frank told her. "They should be ready by morning." "Thank you," Olivia said, and there was genuine warmth in her voice that made Frank's chest tighten in an unfamiliar way. "I am truly grateful for your kindness." Frank nodded and left her to eat in privacy, returning to his chair by the fire. He dozed fitfully through the rest of the night, his body refusing to fully relax despite his exhaustion. When dawn finally broke, the storm had passed, leaving behind a world washed clean and glistening with moisture. Frank checked on Olivia and found her sleeping peacefully, so he quietly gathered her clothes, which had dried overnight, and left them folded outside the bedroom door. He went about his morning chores, feeding the horses and chickens, checking the fence lines for damage from the storm. The physical work helped settle his mind, though he found his thoughts constantly drifting back to the woman sleeping in his house. There was something about her that had gotten under his skin in a way he could not explain. Maybe it was those amber eyes, or maybe it was simply that his lonely existence had left him vulnerable to any human connection, however brief. When Frank returned to the house around mid-morning, he found Olivia in the main room, dressed in her own clothes, which were wrinkled but dry. She had made more coffee and was standing by the window, looking out at the wet landscape. She turned when she heard him enter, and Frank was struck again by her beauty. In the light of day, he could see that she was probably around 26 or 27 years old, with delicate features and thick dark hair that fell in waves past her shoulders. "Good morning," she said. "I hope you do not mind that I made coffee." "Not at all," Frank said, hanging his hat by the door. "How are you feeling?" "Much better, thanks to you," Olivia said. She hesitated, then added, "I should be on my way to Riverton. I have already taken up too much of your time." Frank felt a strange reluctance at the thought of her leaving, but he pushed it aside. "I will take you into town. It is the least I can do." "You have already done more than enough," Olivia protested. "The ride to town is about an hour," Frank said. "You cannot walk it, and your horse is long gone. Let me do this." Olivia studied him for a long moment, and Frank had the unsettling feeling that she could see right through him to all the lonely places he tried to keep hidden. Finally, she nodded. "Very well, thank you." They rode into Riverton together on Duchess, Olivia sitting in front of Frank just as she had the night before, though now the proximity felt different without the urgency of the storm. Frank was acutely aware of every place their bodies touched, of the floral scent of her hair despite her ordeal, of the way she fit perfectly against him as if she had been made to be there. He told himself he was being foolish, that this attraction was just his loneliness talking, but his heart refused to listen to reason. Riverton was a modest town that had grown up along the river that gave it its name, with a main street lined with wooden buildings housing a general store, a saloon, a bank, a hotel, and various other establishments. Frank guided Duchess to the hotel and helped Olivia dismount. She stood before him, looking up at his weathered face with an expression he could not quite read. "I cannot thank you enough for what you did," she said softly. "You saved my life." "I am just glad I saw you in time," Frank said, his voice rougher than he intended. Olivia reached out and touched his hand briefly, and the contact sent a jolt through Frank's entire body. "Perhaps we will meet again," she said. "Perhaps," Frank agreed, though he doubted it. She would go her way, and he would return to his solitary life on the ranch, and this brief intersection of their paths would fade into memory. He watched her walk into the hotel, then turned Duchess toward home, trying to ignore the heaviness that had settled in his chest. The ride back to the ranch felt longer than usual, and when he arrived, the house seemed emptier than it ever had before. Frank threw himself into his work, repairing storm damage and tending to the livestock, but no matter how hard he tried, he could not stop thinking about Olivia Reeves and her amber eyes. 3 days passed, and Frank told himself he was getting back to normal. He rose with the sun, worked until his muscles ached, and fell into bed exhausted each night. But sleep brought dreams of a dark-haired woman, and he woke each morning feeling more hollow than the day before. On the 4th day, Frank decided to ride into Riverton for supplies, though his pantry was still well stocked. He told himself it was just practical to check on things in town, but he knew he was lying. The town was busy when he arrived, wagons moving up and down the main street, people going about their business. Frank tied Duchess to the hitching post outside the general store and went inside, nodding to Mrs. Henderson behind the counter. He wandered the aisles without any real purpose, picking up items he did not need and setting them back down. He was examining a new bridle when he heard a familiar voice behind him. "Mr. Thornton, what a pleasant surprise." Frank turned to find Olivia standing there, a basket over her arm, looking healthier and more vibrant than she had during their last meeting. His heart stuttered in his chest, and he had to clear his throat before he could speak. "Miss Reeves, I did not expect to see you still in town." "I decided to stay for a while," Olivia said, and there was something in her tone that suggested this was not the whole truth. "I have taken a room at the hotel and been exploring Riverton. It is a charming place." "It is home," Frank said simply. They stood in awkward silence for a moment, and then Frank found himself saying, "Would you like to get some lunch? There is a decent restaurant just down the street." Olivia's face lit up with a smile that made Frank's knees weak. "I would like that very much." They walked to the small restaurant together, and Frank held the door open for her, very aware of the curious looks they were drawing from the townspeople. News traveled fast in a place like Riverton, and he knew that by evening, half the town would be speculating about the lonely rancher and the mysterious stranger. They took a table by the window, and a waitress brought them menus and glasses of water. "Tell me about your ranch," Olivia said after they had ordered. "How long have you lived there?" 10 years, Frank said. "I bought the land when I was 22, built the house myself with help from some hired hands. It is not much, but it is mine." "I think it is wonderful," Olivia said warmly. "Having a place that truly belongs to you, that must be a good feeling." "It is," Frank admitted, "though it can be lonely at times." The words were out before he could stop them, and he felt his face heat with embarrassment. He was not the type to share such personal thoughts, especially with someone he barely knew. But Olivia did not laugh or look uncomfortable. Instead, her expression softened with understanding. "I know something about loneliness," she said quietly. "It is part of why I left Boston and came west." "Boston," Frank said, surprised. "That is a long way from Wyoming." "Indeed it is," Olivia agreed. "But I needed a fresh start, somewhere far from my past." Frank wanted to ask more, to understand what had driven her to make such a drastic change, but the arrival of their food interrupted the conversation. They ate in companionable silence for a few minutes, and Frank found himself relaxing in a way he rarely did around other people. There was something easy about being with Olivia, despite the attraction that hummed between them like a plucked string. "What will you do now?" Frank asked finally. "Will you stay in Riverton, or are you just passing through?" Olivia set down her fork and met his gaze directly. "I am not certain yet. I have some money saved, enough to live on for a few months while I decide. I thought perhaps I might find work here, make a new life." "What kind of work?" Frank asked, genuinely curious. "I was a teacher in Boston," Olivia said. "I taught at a school for girls. But I imagine the opportunities here are limited." "The schoolhouse could probably use a good teacher," Frank said. "The last one left 6 months ago, and the children have been making do with lessons from whoever has time to spare." Olivia's eyes widened with interest. "Really? Do you think they might hire me?" "I think they would be lucky to have you," Frank said honestly. "The school board meets on Monday evenings at the town hall. You could present yourself then." "I will do that," Olivia said, and the excitement in her voice made Frank smile. "Thank you for the information." They finished their meal, and Frank walked Olivia back to the hotel, not ready for their time together to end. When they reached the entrance, she turned to him with that same warm smile that had become imprinted on his memory. "Would you like to have dinner with me tomorrow?" Frank found himself asking, the words tumbling out before his natural reticence could stop them. "I could cook something at the ranch if you would be willing to make the ride out." "I would love that," Olivia said without hesitation. "What time should I come?" "I will pick you up at 4, Frank said. "That will give us time to get to the ranch before dark." They said their goodbyes, and Frank rode home with a lightness in his chest that he had not felt in years. He spent the rest of the day, and all of the next morning cleaning his house with a thoroughness it had not seen since he moved in, scrubbing floors and dusting furniture, and even washing the windows. He rode into town early to buy supplies for dinner, selecting the best cuts of meat and fresh vegetables, ignoring Mrs. Henderson's knowing smile as she tallied up his purchases. At 4 o'clock sharp, Frank arrived at the hotel to find Olivia waiting on the porch, dressed in a simple but pretty blue dress that made her amber eyes seem even more striking. He helped her onto Duchess, and they rode out of town together, talking easily about everything and nothing. Olivia told him about her childhood in Boston, about her parents who had passed away from influenza 5 years ago, about the restrictive society that had made her feel like she was suffocating. Frank, in turn, found himself opening up in ways he never had before, talking about his own family, about the father who had drunk himself to death, and the mother who had died of a broken heart soon after. "I am sorry," Olivia said softly. "That must have been very difficult." "It was a long time ago," Frank said, though the pain of those memories never fully faded. "I learned to rely on myself, and I suppose that is not such a bad thing." "No," Olivia agreed, "but neither is learning to rely on others." Her words struck something deep within Frank, a truth he had been avoiding for years. They arrived at the ranch as the sun was beginning its descent toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold. Frank helped Olivia down from the horse and showed her around, pointing out the various buildings and explaining how the ranch operated. She asked intelligent questions and seemed genuinely interested, and Frank felt a swell of pride in showing her what he had built. Inside, Frank cooked dinner while Olivia sat at the kitchen table, sipping wine and keeping him company. The domesticity of the scene struck him with unexpected force. This was what he had been missing all these years, not just another body to fill the empty spaces, but someone to share the small, ordinary moments that made up a life. They ate dinner at the table, and the conversation flowed as easily as the wine. Frank found himself laughing more than he had in years, and the sound felt rusty but good, like a muscle that had atrophied from disuse. After dinner, they moved to the settee by the fireplace, and Frank built up the fire against the cooling evening air. They sat side by side, close but not quite touching, and watched the flames dance in the hearth. Frank was acutely aware of Olivia beside him, of the warmth radiating from her body, of the way her presence seemed to fill the house with life. "Thank you for this," Olivia said softly. "For dinner, for your kindness, for everything." "You do not need to thank me," Frank said, turning to look at her. In the firelight she was breathtakingly beautiful, and he felt his carefully maintained walls beginning to crumble. "I should be thanking you. For what?" Olivia asked, her amber eyes searching his face. "For reminding me what it feels like to not be alone," Frank said, the honesty of the words almost painful. Olivia reached out and took his hand, lacing her fingers through his. The touch was simple, but it felt monumental, like the sealing of some unspoken promise. They sat like that for a long time, not speaking, just existing together in the quiet comfort of each other's presence. When it grew late, Frank reluctantly offered to take Olivia back to town, and they rode through the darkness under a sky full of stars. Over the following weeks, Frank and Olivia fell into a pattern. She presented herself to the school board and was hired on the spot, much to Frank's delight and her own relief. She moved out of the hotel and into a small house that the town provided for the schoolteacher, and she threw herself into her work with passion and dedication. Frank found excuses to come into town more frequently, and they saw each other several times a week, sometimes for meals, sometimes just for walks along the river or conversations on her porch. The townspeople quickly accepted Olivia as one of their own, charmed by her warmth and impressed by her teaching abilities. The children adored her, and Frank would sometimes stop by the schoolhouse at the end of the day just to watch her with her students, marveling at her patience and creativity. She had a gift for making learning feel like an adventure, and the transformation in the children was remarkable. But it was in the quiet moments alone together that Frank felt his heart truly opening to her. She had become essential to him in a way that both thrilled and terrified him. He found himself thinking about her constantly, planning his days around when he might see her next, living for the sound of her laugh and the touch of her hand. He knew he was falling in love, knew it with a certainty that shook him to his core, but he was afraid to say the words, afraid that voicing his feelings might somehow shatter the fragile happiness they had built. One Saturday in early autumn, about 3 months after they had met, Frank invited Olivia to spend the day at the ranch. He had been working on expanding his vegetable garden and thought she might enjoy helping him plant some bulbs for spring. She arrived in the morning, dressed in practical clothes and ready to work, and they spent hours in the garden together, their hands in the soil, talking and laughing as they worked side by side. When they finally finished, dirty and tired but satisfied, Frank brought out a picnic lunch he had prepared, and they spread a blanket under a large cottonwood tree near the house. The day was perfect, warm but not hot, with a gentle breeze that carried the scent of the river. They ate and talked, and Frank found himself watching Olivia more than eating, committing every detail of this moment to memory. "What are you thinking about?" Olivia asked, catching him staring. Frank hesitated, then decided it was time to be brave. "I am thinking about how much my life has changed since I found you in that storm." Olivia set down her sandwich and turned to face him fully. "Mine too," she said softly. "I came west looking for a fresh start, for freedom, but I never expected to find this." "What is this?" Frank asked, his heart pounding. "Happiness," Olivia said simply. "Connection. Someone who sees me for who I truly am and does not want me to be anyone else." Frank reached out and cupped her face in his hand, his thumb brushing across her cheekbone. "I see you," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "And what I see is the most remarkable woman I have ever known." Olivia leaned into his touch, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "Frank, I need to tell you something about why I really left Boston." "You do not have to," Frank said, though curiosity burned in him. "I want to," Olivia insisted. "You deserve to know the truth before this goes any further." She took a deep breath, gathering her courage. "I was engaged to be married. His name was Richard, and he was from a prominent Boston family. Everyone thought we were the perfect match, but the truth was he was cruel. Not physically, but emotionally. He wanted to control every aspect of my life, what I wore, where I went, who I spoke to. I felt like I was drowning, like the life was being squeezed out of me one day at a time." Frank felt anger rise in his chest at the thought of anyone treating Olivia that way, but he remained silent, letting her speak. "One day I realized that if I married him, I would lose myself completely," Olivia continued. "So I broke off the engagement. The scandal was enormous. His family was furious, and they made sure everyone in our social circle knew what I had done. I became an outcast overnight. My teaching position was suddenly terminated, doors that had been open to me slammed shut. I realized I had to leave, start over somewhere where no one knew my past. I am glad you did, Frank said fiercely, because you found your way here to me. Are you not angry that I did not tell you sooner? Olivia asked, searching his face. Why would I be angry? Frank said, genuinely confused. You made the brave choice, the right choice. You chose yourself over what society expected of you. That takes tremendous courage. Olivia's tears spilled over then, and Frank pulled her into his arms, holding her close as she cried against his chest. He stroked her hair and murmured soothing words, his heart aching for what she had endured but also soaring with love for this incredibly strong woman. When her tears subsided, Olivia pulled back and looked up at him. I am falling in love with you, Frank Thornton, she said, her voice steady despite the tears still wet on her cheeks. I tried not to. I told myself it was too soon, that I needed to focus on building my new life, but my heart would not listen. Frank felt his own eyes grow hot with emotion. I love you too, he said, the words feeling both terrifying and liberating. I have loved you since that first night when you looked at me with those amber eyes, and I felt my whole world shift on its axis. He leaned down and kissed her then, a gentle, reverent kiss that held all the longing and hope and love he had been carrying for months. Olivia kissed him back, her arms wrapping around his neck, and Frank felt something inside him that had been broken for a very long time finally begin to heal. They spent the rest of the afternoon wrapped in each other's arms under the cottonwood tree, talking about the future, about what they wanted and hoped for. Frank told her about his dreams of expanding the ranch, maybe raising cattle alongside the horses. Olivia talked about her hopes for the school, about starting a small library for the town. They spoke of these things separately at first, then gradually began to weave their dreams together, creating a shared vision of the life they might build side by side. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in brilliant shades of pink and purple, Frank took both of Olivia's hands in his and looked into her eyes. I know we have only known each other a short time, he said. And I know you just escaped one engagement, so this might be the worst possible timing, but I have to ask. Olivia Reeves, will you marry me? Olivia's breath caught, and for a moment that felt like an eternity, she just stared at him. Then a smile broke across her face like sunrise, and she said, Yes. Yes, Frank, I will marry you. Frank let out a whoop of joy and swept her into his arms, spinning her around until they were both dizzy and laughing. When he set her down, he kissed her again, deeper this time, and Olivia responded with equal passion. They held each other as the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, neither one wanting to let go. They were married a month later in a simple ceremony at the small church in Riverton. The entire town turned out for the wedding, happy to celebrate the union of two people who so clearly belonged together. Mrs. Henderson cried through the entire ceremony, and even the gruff bartender from the saloon was seen wiping his eyes. Olivia wore a simple white dress she had sewn herself, and Frank wore his best suit, which he had bought special for the occasion. When the Reverend pronounced them husband and wife and Frank kissed his bride, a cheer went up from the assembled townspeople that could probably be heard all the way to the mountains. They had a reception at the town hall, with music and dancing and more food than Frank had seen in one place in years. He danced with his new wife until his feet ached, not caring who saw the foolish grin on his face. Olivia glowed with happiness, and Frank thought he had never seen anything more beautiful than her joy. As the evening wound down and they prepared to leave for the ranch, their new home together, Frank pulled Olivia aside for a quiet moment. "Are you happy?" he asked, needing to hear her say it. Happier than I ever thought possible, Olivia assured him, reaching up to cup his face in her hands. You saved me, Frank, not just from the storm, but from a life that would have destroyed me. You gave me a chance to be myself, to be free, and then you loved me for exactly who I am. That is the greatest gift anyone has ever given me. You saved me too, Frank said, his voice thick with emotion. I was just existing before you came along, going through the motions of life without really living. You brought light and warmth and love into my world, and I will spend the rest of my life trying to deserve you. You already do, Olivia said softly, just by being yourself. They rode back to the ranch together under a full moon, and Frank carried his bride over the threshold of their home. The house felt different now, transformed from a lonely bachelor's dwelling into a place of love and laughter. Frank had spent the past weeks preparing for Olivia's arrival, making space for her things, buying furniture for the bedroom, even installing new curtains in the kitchen because she had mentioned liking them. Their wedding night was tender and passionate, a celebration of their love and commitment to each other. Frank had been with women before, brief encounters that meant nothing, but being with Olivia was entirely different. It was not just physical, though the physical was transcendent. It was emotional and spiritual, a joining of souls as much as bodies. Afterward, they lay tangled together in the bed, and Frank stroked Olivia's hair, marveling at the fact that she was his wife, that he got to wake up next to her every morning for the rest of his life. Olivia continued teaching, and Frank continued working the ranch, but they always made time for each other. Breakfast together before Olivia left for school became sacred, a time to talk and plan their day. Evenings were spent preparing dinner side by side, then sitting by the fire and sharing the events of their day. Weekends were for working on the ranch together, for long rides through the canyon, for making love in the middle of the afternoon just because they could. The first winter of their marriage was harsh, with heavy snows that sometimes kept Olivia home from school for days at a time. Frank loved those snow-bound days, when it was just the two of them cocooned in their warm house while the wind howled outside. They would stay in bed late, make love, eat breakfast, make love again, read together by the fire, and then retire early to bed to start the cycle over again. It felt decadent and perfect, and Frank stored up the memories like treasures against some future hardship. Spring came, and with it, news that made Olivia's eyes light up with joy. She was pregnant. Frank's reaction was pure elation mixed with terror. He was going to be a father, a responsibility that seemed almost overwhelming. But Olivia's calm confidence soothed his fears, and he threw himself into preparing for the baby's arrival. He built a cradle with his own hands, spending long hours in the barn workshop to get every detail perfect. Olivia sewed tiny clothes and blankets, and they spent evenings discussing names and making plans. The pregnancy was not easy. Olivia was sick for the first few months, and Frank felt helpless watching her suffer. He did everything he could, bringing her tea and crackers in bed, holding her hair when she was ill, rubbing her feet when they swelled. As her belly grew round with their child, Frank found himself talking to it, telling stories about the ranch and the horses and how much they were looking forward to meeting whoever was growing inside. One afternoon in early autumn, almost exactly a year after Frank had proposed under the cottonwood tree, Olivia went into labor. Frank rode into town at breakneck speed to fetch the doctor and Mrs. Henderson, who served as the town's midwife. The hours that followed were the longest of Frank's life. He paced the floor of the main room while Olivia labored in the bedroom, her cries of pain tearing at his heart. He wanted to be with her, to hold her hand and offer comfort, but Mrs. Henderson had shooed him out, saying he would just be in the way. Finally, as the sun was setting, Frank heard a new sound, the thin, wavering cry of a newborn baby. His heart nearly stopped, and he was at the bedroom door in an instant. Mrs. Henderson emerged, smiling broadly. "You have a son, Mr. Thornton, a healthy, strong boy." Frank pushed past her into the bedroom, where Olivia lay exhausted but radiant, holding a tiny bundle wrapped in a blanket. She looked up at him with tears streaming down her face, and Frank crossed to her side, looking down at his son for the first time. The baby had a shock of dark hair and a red, wrinkled face, and Frank thought he was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen, aside from his mother. "Hello, little one," Frank whispered, reaching out to touch one impossibly tiny hand. The baby's fingers wrapped around his, and Frank felt his heart expand with a love so fierce it almost hurt. "What should we name him?" Olivia asked softly. They had discussed names throughout the pregnancy, but had never quite settled on one. Now, looking at his son, Frank knew exactly what felt right. "James," he said, "after your father." Olivia's eyes filled with fresh tears. "Are you certain?" "I am certain," Frank said, leaning down to kiss her forehead. "James Thornton. It is a good, strong name." The doctor examined both Olivia and the baby and pronounced them healthy, then left them alone to become acquainted with their son. Frank climbed into bed beside Olivia, careful not to jostle her, and they marveled together over the miracle they had created. James nursed for the first time, his small mouth working instinctively, and Frank watched in awe as his wife nourished their child. The following months were challenging as they adjusted to life with a baby. James was a good baby overall, but he still woke frequently during the night to be fed and changed. Frank and Olivia took turns walking him when he was fussy, and Frank discovered a talent for soothing the boy that surprised them both. He would carry James around the ranch, showing him the horses and the chickens, talking to him about everything and nothing, and the baby would usually settle right down. Olivia had to take a break from teaching for a few months, and the school board hired a temporary replacement, understanding and supportive of their teachers' need to care for her newborn. But by the time James was 4 months old, Olivia was eager to return to her students. They arranged for Mrs. Henderson to watch James during school hours, and the older woman doted on the baby as if he were her own grandchild. Life settled into a new rhythm, busier and more chaotic than before, but also richer and more fulfilling. Frank would wake each morning to the sound of his son babbling in his cradle and his wife humming as she dressed for school. He would eat breakfast with his family, kiss his wife goodbye, then spend the day working the ranch. In the evenings, he would play with James while Olivia prepared dinner, and they would eat together as a family, talking and laughing and enjoying the simple pleasure of each other's company. When James was a year old, taking his first wobbly steps and saying his first words, Olivia became pregnant again. This pregnancy was easier than the first, and 9 months later, she delivered a healthy baby girl they named Caroline. Frank fell in love all over again, enchanted by his daughter's delicate features and sweet temperament. James was fascinated by his baby sister, wanting to help with everything, and Frank and Olivia's hearts swelled watching their children together. The years passed in a blur of joy and hard work. The ranch prospered under Frank's careful management, and he was able to hire more hands, which gave him more time with his family. Olivia returned to teaching after Caroline was born, and the children grew up surrounded by love and learning. James was serious and thoughtful like his father, while Caroline was adventurous and spirited. They fought sometimes, as siblings do, but mostly they were the best of friends. Frank often thought back to that stormy night when he had found Olivia on the Ridge Road, and he marveled at how one moment, One decision to ride out into the storm had changed his entire life. He had been so lonely back then, so resigned to a solitary existence, and now his house was full of noise and love and life. Olivia had not just filled the empty spaces in his home, she had filled the empty spaces in his heart. One evening when James was 6 and Caroline was 4, Frank and Olivia stood together on the porch, watching their children play in the yard. The sun was setting, painting the sky in brilliant colors, and Frank wrapped his arm around his wife's waist, pulling her close. "You ever regret it?" he asked quietly. Leaving Boston, coming west, marrying a simple rancher, Olivia looked up at him with those amber eyes that still had the power to make his heart skip a beat. "Never," she said firmly. "This life, this family, this is everything I ever wanted, even before I knew I wanted it. You are my home, Frank Thornton." "And you are mine," Frank said, kissing the top of her head. "You are the calm in my life, the peace I never knew I needed. That storm brought you to me, and I will be grateful for it every day for the rest of my life." James came running up to the porch then, breathless and excited. "Papa, come quick. Caroline caught a frog and she wants to show you." Frank laughed and let his son pull him down the porch steps. Caroline was indeed holding a small frog, looking immensely proud of herself. Frank dutifully admired her catch, then helped her release it back into the grass. The children scampered off to find another adventure, and Frank returned to the porch where Olivia stood watching, a soft smile on her face. As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Frank thought about how much his life had changed. He was no longer a lonely cowboy living in self-imposed isolation. He was a husband, a father, a man who had learned to open his heart and let love in. It had been scary, letting down his walls, allowing himself to be vulnerable, but it had also been the best decision he had ever made. The years continued to unfold, each one bringing new challenges and joys. There were hard times, droughts that tested the ranch's resources, illnesses that frightened them, the normal struggles of raising children and maintaining a marriage. But through it all, Frank and Olivia faced everything together, their love growing deeper and stronger with each passing year. When James turned 16, he announced his intention to become a rancher like his father, and Frank's chest swelled with pride. They began working side by side in earnest, and Frank taught his son everything he knew about managing the land and caring for the animals. Caroline, meanwhile, had inherited her mother's love of teaching and announced her plans to follow in Olivia's footsteps. Both children had grown into fine young people, kind and hardworking and compassionate, and Frank knew he and Olivia had done something right. On their 20th anniversary, Frank took Olivia back to the cottonwood tree where he had proposed all those years ago. They spread a blanket under its branches, which had grown thicker over the years, and shared a meal just as they had that first day. 20 years, Olivia mused, leaning back against Frank's chest. "It seems impossible that so much time has passed." "Best 20 years of my life," Frank said, wrapping his arms around her. She fit against him as perfectly now as she had that stormy night when he had pulled her onto his horse and carried her to safety. "Mine too," Olivia agreed. "Sometimes I think about that night when you found me in the storm. What would have happened if you had not seen me, or if you had decided it was too dangerous to help?" "I would have found you eventually," Frank said with conviction. "Our paths were meant to cross. I believe that with my whole heart." "So do I," Olivia said, turning to look up at him. Her amber eyes still sparkled with the same warmth and intelligence that had first captivated him, though now they were framed by fine lines that spoke of years of laughter and life. "You saved me that night, but you have continued to save me every day since. You gave me a life beyond my wildest dreams. We saved each other, Frank corrected gently. I was just existing before you came along. You taught me how to really live, how to love, how to be happy. Everything good in my life comes from you. They kissed under the cottonwood tree, just as they had 20 years before, and Frank felt the same surge of love and desire he had felt then. Some things never changed, and his love for Olivia was one of them. If anything, it had grown stronger, deepened by years of shared experiences and mutual support. The children grew up and began lives of their own. James took over more and more of the ranch operations, giving Frank time to slow down and enjoy life at a more leisurely pace. Caroline went to teachers' college and returned to Riverton to teach alongside her mother at the schoolhouse. Both children eventually married and started families of their own, giving Frank and Olivia grandchildren to dote on. Frank had never imagined himself as a grandfather, but he discovered he loved it. He would sit on the porch with his grandchildren on his knees, telling them stories about the old days, about how he had found their grandmother in a storm, and how she had changed his life forever. The grandchildren never tired of the story, begging him to tell it again and again, and Frank never tired of telling it, because it was the story of how his real life had begun. As they grew older, Frank and Olivia continued to work and stay active, but they also made time to simply be together. They would sit on the porch in the evenings, holding hands and watching the sun set over the mountains, comfortable in the silence that comes from decades of companionship. They took walks along the river, slower now but no less enjoyable. They read books together by the fire in winter and worked in the garden together in summer. On the morning of their 30th anniversary, Frank woke to find Olivia already awake, watching him with a soft smile. "Good morning, husband," she said, the same greeting she had given him every morning for 30 years. "Good morning, wife," Frank replied, pulling her close for a kiss. "Happy anniversary." "Happy anniversary," Olivia echoed. 30 years, can you believe it? Some days it feels like a lifetime, and some days it feels like we just met yesterday, Frank said honestly. But every single day, I have been grateful to have you by my side. They spent the day celebrating quietly, just the two of them, visiting all the places that held meaning in their relationship. The ridge road where he had found her, though it was well maintained now and bore little resemblance to that stormy night. The restaurant where they had their first meal together, still serving decent food after all these years. The church where they were married, unchanged except for a few fresh coats of paint. The cottonwood tree, now massive and stately, where Frank had proposed. As the sun set on their anniversary day, they stood together in the yard of the ranch, looking at the house they had filled with love and life. The children and grandchildren had visited earlier, bringing gifts and well wishes, and now it was just Frank and Olivia again, as it had been in the beginning. "I love you," Frank said, the words still as powerful and necessary as they had been the first time he spoke them. "I will love you until my last breath, and if there is anything beyond this life, I will love you there too." "And I love you," Olivia said, tears shining in her eyes. "You are everything to me, Frank Thornton. My savior, my husband, my best friend, my home. You are the calm in my life, the steady presence that has guided me through every storm." "You are my calm too," Frank said, realizing the truth of it. "From that first moment, you brought peace to my restless soul. You turned my lonely house into a home, my empty existence into a life worth living." They stood wrapped in each other's arms as the stars began to appear. Two people who had found each other against all odds and built something beautiful together. Their love story had started with a storm, with a desperate rescue and an unlikely meeting, but it had grown into something far greater than either of them could have imagined. The years continued to pass, and Frank and Olivia grew old together, weathering the storms of life just as they had weathered that first storm that brought them together. There were losses along the way, friends and neighbors who passed on, health scares that reminded them of their mortality, the normal sorrows that come with a long life. But there were also countless joys, grandchildren growing up and starting families of their own, the satisfaction of seeing the ranch prosper and the town grow, the simple pleasure of waking up each morning next to the person they loved most in the world. On a spring morning when Frank was 70 and Olivia was 64, they sat together on the porch as they had done countless times before. The ranch was thriving under James's management, and they had finally retired completely, spending their days in quiet contentment. Frank held Olivia's hand, her fingers intertwined with his, and looked out at the land he had worked for nearly 50 years. "I have been thinking," Olivia said, breaking the comfortable silence, "about legacy, about what we leave behind." "And what have you concluded?" Frank asked, curious. "That the greatest thing we built was not the ranch or the house or any material thing," Olivia said thoughtfully. "It was our family, our love, the way we showed our children and grandchildren what it means to truly cherish another person. That is what will last long after we are gone." "You are right," Frank agreed, squeezing her hand gently. "Everything else will fade, but the love we created, that will echo forward through generations." "Tell me again," Olivia said, a smile playing at her lips, "about the night you found me." Frank laughed, recognizing the request she had made countless times over the years. "The storm hit with a fury that matched the devil's own temper," he began, launching into the familiar story. Olivia settled against his shoulder, and though she knew every word by heart, she listened as if hearing it for the first time. When Frank finished the story, Olivia looked up at him with those amber eyes that still had the power to make his heart skip. "My hero," she said softly, "then and always." "My love," Frank replied, "then and always." They sat together in the warm spring sunshine, two people who had spent a lifetime together and still could not get enough of each other. The wind rustled through the cottonwood tree in the yard, the same tree that had witnessed Frank's proposal and so many other important moments in their lives. The ranch was quiet around them, peaceful and prosperous, a testament to years of hard work and dedication. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, Frank thought about all the lonely years before Olivia came into his life, and he could barely remember what that felt like. The loneliness had faded so completely, replaced by a fullness of heart and spirit that he had never known was possible. She had not just stayed after he saved her from the storm. She had become his home, his partner, his reason for waking up each morning with gratitude and joy. "What are you thinking about?" Olivia asked, noticing the faraway look in his eyes. "About how lucky I am," Frank said simply. "That storm could have taken you from me before I ever knew you existed. Instead, it brought you into my life and gave me everything I never knew I needed." "We are both lucky," Olivia said, reaching up to touch his weathered face. "We found each other in the chaos and built something beautiful together. Not everyone gets that." "No," Frank agreed, "not everyone does." They spent the rest of the day, as they spent most of their days now, in quiet companionship, tending the garden, taking a short walk, sitting together and talking about everything and nothing. In the evening, their grandchildren came to visit, filling the house with noise and laughter. Frank watched as Olivia held the newest great-grandchild, a baby girl named Olivia in her honor, and his heart swelled with love and pride. After the family left and the house grew quiet again, Frank and Olivia prepared for bed. They moved slowly now, their bodies not as quick or agile as they once were, but they moved together, a team as they had been for decades. They climbed into bed, and Olivia curled against Frank's side, her head on his chest, his arm around her shoulders. "Good night, my love," Frank whispered, kissing the top of her head. "Good night," Olivia murmured, already drifting toward sleep. Frank lay awake for a while longer, listening to the sound of his wife's breathing, feeling the steady rise and fall of her chest against his side. This was what he had been missing all those years ago when he lived alone in this house. Not just another body in the bed, but this specific person, this remarkable woman who had taken a chance on a lonely cowboy and transformed both their lives in the process. The years ahead held both joy and sorrow, as all years do. Frank and Olivia celebrated more anniversaries, welcomed more great-grandchildren, and watched as their family grew and thrived. They faced health challenges with courage and humor, supporting each other through every difficulty. They traveled a bit, taking a trip to see the ocean that Olivia had always dreamed of visiting, and Frank stood beside her on the shore, watching her face light up with wonder as she saw the vast expanse of water for the first time. But mostly, they stayed close to home, to the ranch and the town that had become so dear to them. Riverton had grown over the years, but it still maintained its small town charm, and Frank and Olivia were beloved members of the community. The school eventually named a new wing after Olivia in recognition of her decades of service, and the town held a ceremony where she was honored by former students who had gone on to become doctors and lawyers and teachers themselves, all of them crediting her with inspiring their love of learning. Frank stood beside his wife as she received the honor, his chest nearly bursting with pride. This incredible woman, who had arrived in Riverton with nothing but the clothes on her back and a determination to start over, had touched countless lives and made an indelible mark on their community. And she had chosen him, had seen something in a lonely cowboy worth loving, and had given him a life beyond his wildest dreams. On a summer evening when Frank was 78 and Olivia was 72, they celebrated their 48th anniversary. The whole family gathered at the ranch for a barbecue, 3 generations coming together to honor the couple who had started it all. Frank and Olivia sat in chairs of honor, holding hands and smiling as their children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren played and laughed around them. James, now middle-aged and still running the ranch, stood to make a toast. "To my parents," he said, raising his glass, "who showed me what true love looks like, who built a life together based on respect and partnership and unwavering devotion, who weathered every storm, both literal and figurative, and came out stronger on the other side. Thank you for the example you set, for the family you created, for the love you gave so freely. Happy anniversary." Everyone raised their glasses and echoed the sentiment, and Frank felt tears prick his eyes. He looked at Olivia and saw that she was crying too, happy tears that spoke of a life well lived and love well given. They kissed to the applause and cheers of their family, and Frank thought his heart might burst from the fullness of it all. As the party wound down and the sun set in a blaze of glory, Frank and Olivia took one last walk around the ranch together. They moved slowly, leaning on each other for support, but they managed to visit all their favorite spots. The cottonwood tree still standing strong after all these years, the garden bursting with vegetables and flowers, the stable where a few of Duchess's descendants still lived, the ridge road where it had all begun on a stormy night 4 decades ago. "You remember what you said to me that night?" Olivia asked as they stood looking at the road. "When you first found me, I said you needed help," Frank recalled, the memory still vivid despite the passage of time. "And I did," Olivia said softly. "I needed help in ways I did not even realize yet. I needed someone to show me that love did not have to be controlling or suffocating. I needed someone to give me the freedom to be myself while also giving me a home to belong to. I needed you, Frank." "And I needed you," Frank said, his voice thick with emotion. "More than I knew. You saved me from a life of loneliness and isolation. You taught me that opening my heart was not a weakness but a strength. You gave me a reason to live instead of just exist." They stood in silence for a moment, remembering that fateful night and all the days and years that had followed. Then, Olivia shivered slightly, and Frank put his arm around her shoulders, drawing her close. "Let us go home," he said, and they walked back to the house together, to the place they had built with their own hands and filled with their love. The seasons continued their eternal cycle, and Frank and Olivia continued on, growing older but not growing apart. They celebrated their 50th anniversary surrounded by family, a milestone that many reach for but not all achieve. Frank gave a speech at the party, his voice still strong despite his years. 50 years ago, I married the most remarkable woman in the world," he said, looking directly at Olivia. "And every day since has been a gift. People talk about marriage being hard work, and it is, but when you are working alongside the right person, it does not feel like work. It feels like building something together, creating a life that is bigger and better than anything either of you could have created alone. Olivia, you are my partner, my love, my best friend, and the calm in my life. Thank you for saying yes 50 years ago. Thank you for choosing me every day since." There was not a dry eye in the room, and Olivia stood and crossed to Frank, throwing her arms around him as everyone applauded. They danced together, slow and careful but still graceful, moving as one as they had learned to do over 50 years of partnership. The song ended, and they kissed, and Frank thought about how miraculous it was that this woman was still his, that they were still here together after all these years. The years that followed were quieter, as Frank and Olivia's health began to decline. They faced these challenges as they had faced everything else together. When Frank had a heart scare, Olivia was by his side in the hospital, holding his hand and refusing to leave. When Olivia's arthritis made it hard for her to do the things she loved, Frank was there to help, never complaining, always patient. They took care of each other with the same devotion they had shown from the beginning. On a crisp autumn morning, when the leaves on the cottonwood tree had turned gold and the air held the promise of winter, Frank and Olivia sat on the porch as they had done thousands of times before. Frank was 82 now, and Olivia was 76, and they both knew that their time together was growing shorter. But on this morning, with the sun warm on their faces and their hands clasped together, they felt nothing but gratitude. "I want you to know something," Olivia said, her voice still clear despite her years. "If I could go back and do it all again, I would not change a single thing. Every moment, good and bad, led us here to this life we built together, and it has been the greatest adventure of my life." "Mine too," Frank agreed, lifting her hand to his lips and kissing it gently. "You are the best thing that ever happened to me, Olivia Thornton, the very best thing." They sat in comfortable silence after that, watching the world go by, content in each other's presence. The ranch was thriving under James's care, and their family was happy and healthy, their legacy secure. They had lived a good life, a full life, a life rich in love and meaning. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, Frank pulled Olivia closer. "Thank you," he said softly, "for staying, for becoming my home, for being the calm in my life." "Thank you for saving me," Olivia replied, resting her head on his shoulder. "For seeing me, truly seeing me and loving what you saw, for giving me a life beyond my wildest dreams." They watched the sun disappear below the horizon, bringing an end to another day. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new joys, but they would face them together, as they always had. Frank thought back to that stormy night when he had found a woman struggling on the ridge road, and how pulling her onto his horse had been the single most important decision of his life. The storm had brought her to him, but love had made her stay. And in staying, she had transformed his life in ways he never could have imagined. She had taken a lonely cowboy living in isolation and shown him what it meant to truly live, to open his heart and let love in. She had become not just his wife but his partner, his best friend, his reason for everything. The years continued to unfold, each day a gift, each moment precious. Frank and Olivia grew older still, their bodies slowing but their love remaining constant. They spent their final years much as they had spent all the others, together, supporting each other, loving each other, grateful for every moment they were given. And when the time came, years later, for their story to end, they faced that too as they had faced everything else in their lives, hand in hand, hearts united, secure in the knowledge that their love would echo forward through the generations they had created together. Their children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren would carry pieces of their story with them, would remember the love that Frank and Olivia had shown them, would strive to build relationships as strong and enduring as the one their patriarch and matriarch had modeled. The ranch would continue, generation after generation caring for the land that Frank had first claimed as a lonely young man. The house would continue to be filled with love and laughter, just as Frank and Olivia had filled it. The cottonwood tree would continue to stand as a silent witness to the love story that had unfolded beneath its branches. And the people of Riverton would continue to tell the story of the lonely cowboy who saved a woman from a storm, and how she stayed and became the calm in his life, transforming both their existences into something beautiful and lasting. In the end, that is what love does. It transforms, it elevates, it creates something greater than the sum of its parts. Frank and Olivia had discovered this truth on a stormy night decades ago, and they had spent the rest of their lives proving it, day after day, year after year, through joy and sorrow, triumph and challenge. They had built a life together, a family, a legacy of love that would endure long after they were gone. And as the sun set on their story, as all stories must eventually end, one thing remained clear and undeniable. The storm had brought them together, but it was love, pure and true and unwavering, that had made them whole. Frank had saved Olivia's life that night on the ridge road, but she had saved his too, in ways far more profound than physical rescue. She had saved him from loneliness, from isolation, from a life half-lived. She had given him purpose and joy and meaning. In return, he had given her freedom, safety, and a love that never sought to control or diminish but only to uplift and cherish. Together, they had created something remarkable, a partnership built on mutual respect and devotion, a love story for the ages. And though their time on earth was finite, as all human time must be, the love they shared and the family they created would continue on, a testament to what two people can build when they choose each other, day after day, year after year, for a lifetime. The legacy of Frank and Olivia Thornton lived on in every life they touched, in every child they raised, in every person who witnessed their love and was inspired to seek the same for themselves. The lonely cowboy had found his calm, and the woman escaping her past had found her home, and together they had written a love story that would be remembered and retold for generations to come. A reminder that sometimes the greatest adventures begin with a single act of kindness on a stormy night.